If Jesus had begun his ministry in our day rather than 2,000 years ago, I wonder how it might have looked different. There was no news coverage in first century Roman Empire. There was no radio or TV, no cameras, no cell phones, no social media. If Jesus began today, no doubt he would often be a trending topic on Twitter, and people would post videos of him on Instagram. Perhaps Jesus himself would make YouTube videos and TikTok posts. Certainly things would be very different. But Jesus would not put everything out there for the masses. Yes, Jesus in the first century spoke often to the crowds, but some of his most important teachings were reserved for private, with the disciples alone as the audience. That's the case in the scripture reading we just heard. The passage makes clear that Jesus does not want the crowds to hear when he tries for a second time to teach the disciples about his upcoming arrest and execution and resurrection. Not that the disciples seem to be able to understand. The disciples often don't get it. If Jesus were teaching these disciples today, it wouldn't make YouTube or Instagram. This is not for the curious. It is just for the dedicated adherents. And if Jesus were teaching today, neither would he take a child and put it in the disciples' midst. I suspect the disciples would still argue over who was the greatest. But a child would simply not help Jesus make the point he's trying to make. Images of Jesus embracing children are popular ones, and they fit well into our modern romanticized views of childhood. But they wouldn't have worked so well in Jesus' day. Jesus is trying to illustrate what it means to be a servant of all and last of all. And that's not how children would function. Children are something we spend a lot of energy and invest a lot of time in. And there's nothing really countercultural about an important person engaging with children. But Jesus' behavior with children is incredibly countercultural. Children in first century Palestine were certainly loved and cherished by their parents, but their life was very different from the life of children today. Child mortality approached 50%. Children were not as valued as they are today, although I'm sure they were by their individual parents. There were no schools, no sports leagues, no public playgrounds, almost nothing in the way of investment on society's part in the nurture of children. Children belonged to their parents until they became adults at around 12 for girls and 14 for boys. And parents could, and sometimes did, sell their children into slavery to pay off a debt. In such a world, important people did not engage with children other than their own. There was no children's time at the local synagogue. There was no vacation Torah camp. And certainly no Roman governor and no local authority would spend any of their valuable time with the local children. The disciples clearly have their culture's view of children in mind when, in an episode on the very next page of Mark's Gospel from our reading, they attempt sternly to shoo away children that people are bringing for Jesus to bless. Jesus had just taught them that whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. But the disciples still cannot imagine that someone as important as Jesus would be able to expend the time with children. His time was far too valuable. But that was the first century. What about now? Who would Jesus reach for if he was looking for someone to be an example of what it meant to be a servant-type disciple? If he wanted to impress upon us the need to welcome those that our society does not expect us to welcome, that our society doesn't think can give anything to us in return. I'm not sure there's really any exact correspondence to the example of children in Jesus' day, but perhaps there are some different examples that would work for different people. There are people in our world that we tend to avoid, ignore, shoo away. Lots of people like that. Take homeless people, for instance. Homeless people often seem not even to be seen by most people. There's actually a nonprofit that works with homeless called Invisible People. And I ran across an article on homelessness that had this in it. I once heard a story about a homeless man on Hollywood Boulevard who really thought he was invisible. But one day a kid handed him a Christian pamphlet. The homeless guy was shocked and amazed. "What? You can see me? How can you see me? I'm invisible." Michelle Obama, in one of her podcasts, talks about how black people occasionally feel invisible. Many black men say that hailing a cab will quickly illustrate how invisible they are, and people of color routinely report that upon entering a high-end store, they seem to be completely invisible to all of the sales clerks. Probably most of us have been made to feel invisible at some point in our lives, but for the majority of us, it is not because of who we are. If the waiter ignores me for long enough, I will start to get upset. I expect to be noticed and attended to. But there are people for whom the experience of being ignored and invisible is so routine that that is what they come to expect. I've only named a couple of examples of this invisibility, but I suspect that you can come up with other examples of those who are made to feel unimportant or uninvisible. And it's just such people that Jesus has in mind when he says, anyone who welcomes one such person in my name welcomes me. Jesus is trying to illustrate what it looks like to be last of all and servant of all. The very thing that he says makes one great. To be last of all and servant of all means that there's not anyone who can be invisible or who I can ignore. There's not anyone who is unimportant enough or unimpressive enough that I needn't notice them, needn't care about them, needn't offer them whatever help that I can. I'm reasonably certain that this is not our society's definition of greatness. We don't see it that way. There are lots of things that make one great in our culture, but being last of all and servant of all doesn't really make the list. Being rich does. Being successful does. Having lots of followers on Twitter or thousands of views on YouTube and TikTok does. Being an accomplished athlete does. Having power does. Being able to get what you want does. But despite the popular fiction that America is a Christian nation, the way of Jesus has never really been all that popular. It would certainly seem that the first disciples struggled with that as well. And that perhaps gives me some hope. I have met a few people who do seem to embody the teaching of Jesus about being last of all, servant of all, and those people are a joy to be around. They always have time for you, no matter who you are. That makes me think that Jesus must have been a joy to be around, that he always has time for you, a moment for you, no matter who you are. I know plenty of people who think of God as simply a cosmically big version of people who are important and powerful in our world. But that is not the God Jesus shows us. A God who is especially attuned to and concerned for those who are seen in our world as unimpressive and unimportant. Jesus turns out to be a very strange sort of Messiah who shows us a very strange sort of God, a God who welcomes and embraces children, homeless, immigrants, refugees, sex workers, mentally ill, those who are abused, all who feel abandoned and ignored in our world. And Jesus invites us to become more like him, more like God, and to help him share the unexpected love of God with a hurting world. All praise and glory to the God who we meet in Jesus, a God who shows us the way of human life, a Jesus who shows us the face of God. Thanks be to God.